Load up again. Where did I get to when it crashed? If anybody can fill me in.
Let's see. You were asking Moses, David, and Jacob.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, it looks like it's back up and running, I hope. Okay, so sorry about the technical difficulties. So if it finished up talking about Jacob, Moses, and David fleeing, then the rest of the Midrash goes on to say, and I apologize if I get this too much of a repeat, that the Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, meaning the Israelites in the wilderness, such great ones, David, Moses, Jacob, were fearful and fled from those who hated them. Yet for those 40 years that you were in the desert, I did not let them flee. Instead, I felled all their haters before them, in that I myself was with them. Not only that, but I did not allow the animals to hurt you, scorpions, snakes, all those things. Therefore, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, record the journeys that Israel undertook in the desert in order that they should know what kind of miracles I performed for them. So what the Midrash is going for here is trying to say that this list of all of the places where we stopped is not just to our credit that we followed God in the middle of nowhere, but it's also to God's credit that in the middle of nowhere, with no defense, no fortifications, no support, we were able to stay and not have to run away from our enemies because God protected us. So this is sort of transitioning from our praise to God's praise, to look at a celebration of God's defense, that even in all of these places, when we had all of these challenges and all of these problems, God did not let us run back to Egypt, and God did not let our attackers overcome us. Instead, we got through it thanks to God's support. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next section from Bamidbar Rabbah, which gives a different parable to explain this. This is like to a king whose son was ill, who took him to a certain place to heal him. When they returned, his father began recounting the stages. Here we slept, here we cooled off, here you had a headache. After all, he was sick. Similarly, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, recount to them all the places where they provoked me. All right, a little bit more of a head scratcher on this one. That if you were a king taking the prince to be healed and you were recounting all the different points, well, that's kind of nice, you know, especially if the kid was a bit out of it or didn't really, remember it so well. Doing a little recount of the trip that took you from where he was sick to where he was healed, that's nice. It's kind of touching. But to finish here with provoking, well, what kind of illness did we have? What kind of provocation were we giving? And why would this be a positive thing to continue to remind ourselves of? I mean, it's a general rule of thumb that when you're having an argument with someone, you should not bring up old settled fights, right? Once a fight has been settled, you don't badger the person about it year after year after year. This may seem to be a little bit iffy on that. However, we're going to see that there's a good reason for this concept, and one that does turn out to have a positive understanding. And we'll be reading from the commentary of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. So the Midrash teaches the journeys of the children of Israel are passages, that is to say, the travels which the Jews take from place to place, atone for these are your gods, Israel, the declaration that was used at the time of the golden calf, for the blemish of idolatry. So what it's saying is that these travels were actually a form of atonement, a form of cleansing ourselves from the sin of idolatry. For even if there is no actual worshiping of idolatry, there is the blemish of idolatry. What does that mean? This is because a marring of faith is also the concept of idolatry, that idolatry is not only bowing down to a statue. To get to that point, to conceive of idolatry, you have to first have some crisis of faith, something that is broken in your understanding of God. This is as is brought in the name of the Baal Shem Tov on the verse, and you will stray and worship other gods. As soon as one turns from God, that is to say, the straying, it is the concept of idolatry, that there is a straying and a worshiping. Turning from God means inexorably turning towards idolatry. And since we turned from God in numerous places, even if we didn't worship other gods like we did the golden calf in all those places, that turning still had to be recorrected, course corrected, if you will. But through the travels of the Jews, it is atoned. As long as there is idol worship in the world, there is divine wrath in the world. It had to be fixed. It follows that when the blemish of idolatry is atoned, divine wrath is mitigated and compassion is evoked. That eventually we were able to right our course, and that is what allowed the full flow of compassion, of mercy, of care that allowed our journey to be complete. So he sees this as both a literal understanding of the journey of the Israelites in the wilderness and a metaphorical understanding of our own personal or communal journey of moving in the right direction towards God and preventing ourselves from turning away from God in a way that is akin to idolatry, even if we're not bending our knee before an idol. Make sense? All right. So we're going to read Ramban about Rambam, because he gives a very good summary. Rambam, of course, is also known as Maimonides, and trying to explain why, again, this whole list would be here. What possible reason could we have? We've had a few that we've mentioned, but it doesn't hurt to have another understanding. So Maimonides added in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, his great work of philosophy, another benefit from knowledge, another benefit from the knowledge, meaning from this list, saying there was a very great necessity in mentioning the journeys, for the miracles that were done were seen as true by all who saw them. In later times, these events would be matters of hearsay, and those who hear about them might deny them. Now, among the greatest miracles and wonders in the Torah is Israel's survival in the wilderness for 40 years and finding the manna every day, although these places are very far from cultivated settlements and not natural habitat for human beings, not being a place of seed or of figs or of vines or of pomegranates. And the Torah states, you have not eaten bread, neither have you drunk wine or strong drink. So it's easy to think that the first generation would remember the power of the miracle of living through this, but later generations might have trouble with that. And that's a problem, says Rambam, since this is one of the greatest miracles we have recorded in the entire Torah. So how do we fix that? All these are signs of events of a miraculous nature, which were seen by the eye. But the Creator, blessed be He, knew that these wonders would be subject to the process which occurs to historical events, that those who hear them will not believe them. We have a natural skepticism, sometimes born out of experiencing too much exaggeration, that if we haven't seen it, we don't always believe it. And especially as distance continues in time, that only gets worse. And that means that people will think that the sojourn of the Israelites in the wilderness was near the cultivated settlement, where people can live there, such as the deserts in which the Arabs live today, or places where there was plowing and harvesting, or where there were grasses and plants suitable for human consumption, and that there were wells of water in those places. So we who live in a generation that unfortunately has many who deny anything like the Exodus at all, we should understand that even 1,000 years ago, there were people who denied the miraculousness of the Exodus, not by denying the Exodus, but by simply imagining that it couldn't have been all that bad. It couldn't have been all that barren. Maybe they were on this side or that side, here or there, which would have been a lot easier than in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, which even 1,000 years ago, people knew was not a place for a community to live. Therefore, in order to remove from people's hearts all such thoughts and to firmly establish all these miracles, he recorded as a memorial the journeyings, so that the future generations would see them and acknowledge the great wonders in keeping people alive in such places for 40 years. So that's Rambam's comment, that by having this detailed list of all of these ridiculous, out-of-the-way places where nobody lived and nothing grew, that was an added detail that would help convince people that really the journey was impossible to make without God's assistance. So the detail was there to convince the skeptics. As Ramban adds, thus the writing down of the stages of the journeying was a commandment of God, either for the reasons mentioned above from Rambam or from some of the others that Ramban brought in his longer commentary, or for some other reason, a purpose the secret of which has not been revealed to us. So I always like that Ramban is humble enough to say, this is a good enough reason why God would have commanded to have it recorded, not for the people of that generation, who knew very well what they had been through and what God had done for them, but for the benefit of later generations who would need extra evidence. But you know what? It could be a different reason. Perhaps there is some other reason why God included this in the Torah that we have not yet been able to deduce, that we have not yet had exposed to us, revealed to us through our study. So we keep studying, because that is how we learn the next idea, the next insight. And Rashi, who we usually start with, I thought was a very fitting finale this time. And as you will see, he brings to light some of the issues that some of our students were discussing at the very beginning of this study. Although God had decreed against them to make them move about and wander in the wilderness, you should not think that they wandered and moved about without cessation from one station to another station all the 40 years, and that they had no rest. For you see that there are here only 42 stages. Deduct from them 14, all of which were their stopping places in the first year after they left Egypt, before the decree was made. Remember that the decree that it would take for the 20-year-olds to pass away, which ended up being 40 years, the 20 and older, was only made with the failing of the spies. So we can take all of the stages that happened before that as simply being necessary places that we had to travel in order to get from Egypt to Sinai to Israel. After that, sorry, I lost my place on the page. Right. Further, deduct from them the 8 stages which were after Aaron's death, which we brought up at the very beginning, from Mount Hor to the plains of Moab in the 40th year, meaning on to the frontier of Israel itself. Those, of course, were from the moment where Aaron died, we were beginning our rapid progress straight towards Israel, which means those also were not part of the punishment for failing to heed the positive report of Joshua and Caleb. It follows then that during the whole of the 38 years, not counting the years that we spent at Sinai, that they made only 20 journeys. That if you remove those that happened before the decree and those that happened once we were then on a laser focus to get to the border, that we only had 20 different places that we moved. And 20 places over 40 years, that is not exactly a nomadic lifestyle. And indeed, you could go through a more detailed timeline, and you would see that there were only a few places where we stayed for multiple years, and then others that were shorter journeys and minor events. But the bulk of our time was spent in only a handful of places. We were indeed trapped in the desert waiting for the next generation to rise that could lead us into the land of Israel, but we were not constantly in moving and unceasing travel. That would have been more painful and more onerous than being able to at least have a place where we could rest for years at a time. And in a way, Rashi is summarizing everything that we've looked at so far, that our willingness to be patient with God, our willingness to follow God was to our credit, God's ability to protect us, even as we stayed in a few places, and to provide for us as we stayed in those places, which could certainly not have supported human life for years at a time in that area, should make us realize that recounting this full list and everything that happened throughout this time is indeed an amazing spiritual journey. It is a great way to reinforce our appreciation of what our ancestors were willing to do and what God was willing to do for them. And indeed, our own journeys over the last 3,000 years, even since we entered the land of Israel, those too, our study of history and our study of the life of our people and the study of how God has enabled our people to survive despite the various hardships and despite the various tragedies, should fill us with hope and with a passionate faith that it's not by accident that our people continue to persist, that there is an underlying narrative that has ensured that we can still be here. Sometimes when people teach Jewish history, it often gets reduced just to the highlights, which are usually the lowlights, the tragedies of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. But we forget there are 2,000 and 3,000 years in between a lot of those highlights. And during those years, people lived, they had families, they had joy, they dealt with their businesses, their farms, their neighbors, their communities. There was life, and God ensured that there would be life for them. And our people continued to hold on to Judaism, even in those places where life might be difficult, throughout that entire time. That should also be kept as to their credit as well as to God's. And we, who may have it much easier now than most other Jews ever have throughout all of our history, we should be likewise thankful for the place that we have, the life that we live, and continue to hold on to everything that God has given us so that this journey can keep going, and another day, another year, another decade will be added to the record. Any additional questions or comments before we wrap it up today? Again, I apologize for the technical problems in the middle of the class.
It's that they could go through such a journey, and life does turn out to keep going.
I couldn't understand all of that, John. The internet connection was very shaky.
I was just saying that it's very inspiring to modern readers to know that our ancestors could go through such a challenging journey, and God is always delivering us from one stage to the next.
Yes, yeah, I got that very loud and clear. You're absolutely right that the historical, the more we read history, the more we should be inspired. History should fill us with that sense of inspiration, hope, and wonder. And this little set of verses is kind of a microcosm of that experience. It's not just places and dates and the way some people learn history, but it is real people, real events, real lives that were amazing, and amazing that they were able to continue. All right. Any other questions or comments despite our internet troubles today? All right. Well, thank you always for your patience in dealing with the technology. And thank you all for joining me this afternoon for our study. And I look forward to studying Torah again next week. And of course, Mishnah tonight and Pathway to Judaism tomorrow night. Take care, everyone, and be well.